She was the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. She had former presidents on her board. She had a $9 billion company. And she did it all without a single working product. Elizabeth Holmes didn't just lie to investors. She hacked the psychology of the most powerful men in America. She wore a costume. She lowered her voice. She never blinked. This isn't just a story about a failed business. It is a masterclass in how to manufacture a God complex. Here's what most people miss about Elizabeth Holmes. She didn't stumble into her image. She engineered it. Former employees described her early appearance at Theranos. Frumpy sweaters, gray pantsuits, normal voice, forgettable. Then came the transformation. An employee who had worked at Apple suggested she upgrade her appearance. Holmes asked about Steve Jobs. What did he wear? Black Issey Miyake turtlenecks. Holmes tracked down the designer. She ordered the same style. From that moment forward, it became her uniform. Black turtleneck, black slacks, black blazer. Every public appearance, every investor pitch, every magazine cover. The uniform wasn't fashion, it was semiotics. Steve Jobs wore black turtlenecks, and Steve Jobs changed the world. Therefore, black turtlenecks signal world-changing genius. The logic is absurd, but symbols don't operate on logic. They operate on association, and Holmes understood association. Now consider the voice. Multiple former employees reported that Holmes's voice changed. They described her natural speaking voice as higher-pitched, standard for a woman in her 20s. One employee recalled walking past Holmes's office late at night. She was alone. Her voice was different, higher, more natural. Another remembered a company party. Holmes had been drinking. She fell out of character, they said. The deep baritone disappeared. Research on vocal perception explains the motive. Lower voices are perceived as more authoritative, more competent, more trustworthy, particularly in women, particularly in male-dominated fields. Holmes's family later claimed the voice was natural, deep like her grandmother's, but the employees who heard both versions tell a different story. The turtlenecks, the voice, the unblinking stare. This wasn't personality, this was construction. Social engineering in its purest form. And it worked because people don't question what feels authentic, they question what feels fake. Holmes understood that authenticity is performance. You don't need to be genuine, you need to appear consistent. If someone crafted their persona this carefully, would you notice the truth? Picture this scenario. You're considering investing in a medical technology startup. The founder is young, unproven. The technology sounds impossible. But then you learn who's on the board. George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Reagan. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State under Nixon. James Mattis, four-star Marine General. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Now ask yourself, would these men join the board of a fraudulent company? Of course not. That's the logic. That's the trap. Elizabeth Holmes didn't recruit board members for their expertise in blood testing. She recruited them for their credibility. These men were not advisors, they were human shields. Authority bias is elegant in its simplicity. When someone we perceive as an authority endorses something, we assume they've verified it. We assume their judgment is sound. But that assumption requires another assumption, that the authority figure actually investigated the claims. They rarely do. James Mattis testified at Holmes's trial that his primary source of information about Theranos was Elizabeth Holmes herself. He didn't review the lab data. He didn't consult independent scientists. He trusted her presentations. She told him the technology had been validated by the FDA. It hadn't. She told him it was being used by the World Health Organization. It wasn't. But Mattis believed her. And when a four-star general believes something, who are you to question it? That's the mechanism. The board wasn't there to provide oversight. It was there to prevent questions. George Shultz's grandson worked at Theranos, Tyler Shultz. He worked in the lab. He saw the technology failing. He documented errors. He raised concerns. He was shut down. Tyler went to his grandfather with evidence. George Shultz sided with Holmes. When Tyler became a source for the Wall Street Journal investigation, Theranos sent lawyers to George Shultz's house. They pressured Tyler to sign legal agreements silencing him. George Shultz sat there, in the room, while his grandson was threatened. Tyler refused. His family spent nearly $500,000 defending him from Theranos' legal warfare. They sold their house. That's what authority accomplishes when weaponized. It doesn't just attract believers, it paralyzes doubt. Critics couldn't just question the technology, they had to question Henry Kissinger's judgment. They had to question whether they knew better than these titans of American power. Most people don't have that confidence, and Holmes knew it. Could you have questioned a 4-star general and still felt safe? Strip away the mythology, strip away the board members and the magazine covers and the black turtlenecks. Here's what Theranos actually claimed. A device called the Edison could perform over 200 blood tests using a few drops of blood from a finger prick. Faster, cheaper, more accurate than conventional methods. Revolutionary. Except it violated basic principles of laboratory science. Different tests require different blood volumes. Complex diagnostics need sufficient sample size for accuracy. You cannot compress the laws of chemistry to fit a narrative about innovation. Phyllis Gardner, a Stanford medical professor, told Holmes this directly. Holmes didn't care. She wasn't building technology. She was building belief. Evidence presented at trial revealed the Edison could perform only a handful of basic tests. Even those produced unreliable results. So Theranos used the same conventional machines every other laboratory uses. Siemens analyzers, standard equipment. The revolutionary technology didn't exist, but Theranos didn't tell investors that, didn't tell Walgreens, didn't tell Safeway. Safeway spent $350 million remodeling 800 stores for Theranos blood testing centers, for technology that didn't work. Employees inside the lab saw it immediately. Tyler Shultz noticed quality control was a disaster. The same test run twice produced wildly different results. Data was being altered, failed results deleted, accurate results selectively highlighted. Another employee, Erica Chung, had her own blood tested by a Theranos device. It showed severe vitamin D deficiency. Conventional tests showed she was fine. That's not innovation, that's malpractice. There's a moment in every fraud where fake it till you make it crosses into criminal deception. It's the moment you know it doesn't work and you keep selling it anyway. Holmes crossed that line repeatedly. She told the board the FDA had validated the technology. False. She told Walgreens the devices could perform tests they couldn't perform. False. She told investors the company was generating revenue it wasn't generating. False. She knew the analyzers produced inaccurate results. She knew they could only perform a few basic tests. She knew Theranos relied on conventional machines. And she kept raising money. Over $700 million from investors who believed they were funding a revolution. Fraud at scale requires infrastructure. It requires systems that suppress doubt and punish dissent. Theranos operated as a sealed environment. Every employee signed aggressive non-disclosure agreements. These weren't standard confidentiality clauses. They were designed to prevent employees from discussing what they saw with anyone outside the company. When employees raised concerns, they were met with hostility. Some were fired immediately. Others were threatened into silence. Theranos hired David Boies, famous attorney. His reputation added another layer of institutional credibility, but inside the company, his firm served one function: enforcement.
When whistleblowers emerged, Theranos deployed legal warfare. When Tyler Schultz spoke to the Wall Street Journal, Theranos sent lawyers to his home. They demanded he sign agreements preventing him from cooperating with journalists or regulators. When Erica Chung became a source, Theranos hired private investigators and threatened lawsuits. The company even hired reputation management firms to scrub negative information from Wikipedia. This wasn't self-defense. This was systematic intimidation. Former employees described a culture of enforced isolation. Lab workers couldn't discuss results with engineers. Engineers couldn't see full test data. Information was compartmentalized deliberately. Sunny Balwani, Holmes' romantic partner and Theranos president, allegedly enforced this culture through psychological pressure. Former employees described verbal abuse, particularly toward anyone who questioned the technology. At trial, Holmes alleged Balwani controlled and abused her for a decade. Balwani denied it. He later became convicted separately on all fraud counts and sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison. What the culture of silence accomplished was delay. Even when dozens of employees knew the technology failed, fear kept them quiet. And that fear allowed Theranos to continue fundraising, continue testing patients with faulty devices for years. Fear is cheaper than innovation. Holmes understood that.
John Carreyrou received a tip in 2015. A pathologist doubted Holmes' claims. That tip led to former employees willing to risk legal retaliation to speak. Tyler Schultz became a source. So did Adam Rosendorf, Theranos' former lab director, who forwarded over 150 internal emails documenting failures. Carreyrou's first article appeared in the Wall Street Journal on October 15, 2015. It revealed Theranos used conventional machines for most tests. It revealed the Edison produced inaccurate results. It revealed systematic deception of partners and investors. Holmes' response was immediate. She returned to headquarters and held a company meeting. Employees stood and chanted, according to Carreyrou's reporting, "Fuck you, Carreyrou." Publicly, Holmes called the article factually and scientifically erroneous. David Boies threatened lawsuits against Carreyrou and the Journal. Even Holmes went directly to Rupert Murdoch. He owned the Wall Street Journal. He had also invested $125 million in Theranos personally. She asked him to kill the story. Murdoch refused. He lost his entire investment, but the story survived, and that changed everything. Carreyrou published additional reports. Each one added detail. FDA inspections began. CMS launched investigations. In 2016, Theranos voided 2 years of blood test results. 2 years! Real patients, real health decisions, faulty data. In 2018, the SEC charged Holmes and Balwani with fraud. Holmes settled, paid a $500,000 fine, and was barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company for 10 years. Theranos dissolved that year. Federal prosecutors filed criminal charges in 2018, wire fraud and conspiracy. The trial began in 2021, 4 months. Holmes testified for 7 days. January 3, 2022, guilty on 4 counts. 1 count conspiracy to defraud investors, 3 counts wire fraud involving over $140 million. November 18, 2022, sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. February 2025, Federal Appeals Court upheld her conviction and sentence. She is currently serving her sentence in Texas. So why did this exposure succeed when others failed? Because Carreyrou didn't just question the technology, he questioned the authority protecting it. He documented failures with precision. He published despite legal threats. He found people willing to risk everything to tell the truth. Eventually, the authority couldn't hold. Not against evidence, not against journalism, not against persistence.
When evidence speaks, who do you trust, fame or facts? There's a seductive logic to the Theranos story. Elizabeth Holmes was the villain. She lied, she manipulated, she exploited trust. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Because the fraud didn't succeed in a vacuum. It succeeded because of us. Our desire for the genius savior narrative. Our willingness to believe confidence over evidence. Our assumption that powerful people wouldn't endorse something false. Holmes built her deception on foundations most of us still trust. Authority figures, prestigious credentials, the mythology of the visionary dropout who changes the world. She understood that belief is more powerful than proof. That if you can make people feel like they're witnessing history, they'll stop asking whether it's real. The board members weren't stupid. The investors weren't naive. The journalists who celebrated her weren't incompetent. But they all wanted to believe. They wanted the story of the teenage genius, the female Steve Jobs, the breakthrough that saves lives and generates billions. And that desire created vulnerability. Authority bias, social proof, FOMO, the halo effect. These aren't exotic psychological exploits. They're how we make decisions every day. We assume powerful endorsements mean verification. We assume consensus means truth. We assume confidence means competence. But assumptions aren't evidence, and belief isn't proof. The Theranos fraud lasted over a decade because people chose belief over verification. They chose the story over the science. They chose the image over the data. And when employees tried to tell them the truth, they chose loyalty to the founder over loyalty to facts. So here's the uncomfortable question. The next Elizabeth Holmes is already operating, building a board, crafting an image, telling a story people want to believe, backed by powerful names, covered by prestigious media, celebrated as a visionary. When you encounter them, what will you trust? The credentials of the people standing behind them, or the evidence of whether it works? The names endorsing them, or whether they can prove their claims? Because the Theranos collapse wasn't inevitable. It required journalists willing to investigate despite legal threats, whistleblowers willing to sacrifice their careers and their families' savings, regulators willing to act when the evidence became undeniable. Without them, Theranos would still be operating, still testing blood, still producing faulty results, still raising hundreds of millions. The mirage would still be standing. Most frauds don't collapse, they just fade into normalized deception. So think about that the next time someone with a black turtleneck and a revolutionary idea asks for your belief. Think about what you're being asked to accept without evidence. Think about why you want to believe them, and ask yourself whether that desire is blinding you. Because the con only works if we let it. And we let it every time we choose the story over the proof. There is another Elizabeth Holmes operating right now. Who do you think it is? Name them.